You were born to help him. The moment I realized my family never loved me. I never questioned my place in my family, not because I felt loved or cherished, but because I was conditioned to believe that whatever my parents said, whatever they expected, was just the natural order of things. My name is Mia, I'm 24, and until recently, I thought my life was normal. Looking back, the signs were always there. The way my parents doted on my older brother, Blake, 28, as if he were some kind of prodigy. The way every decision, every sacrifice, was expected to be made in his favor, not mine. It wasn't obvious at first. Not the kind of blatant favoritism you see in movies, where one child is a prince, and the other is Cinderella scrubbing floors. No, my parents were smarter than that. They gave me food, a roof over my head, a decent education. But they also made sure I knew my place. Blake was the golden child, the future of the family, the one they were investing in. I was support staff. I existed to make sure he had what he needed, even if it meant sacrificing my own wants and needs. If we fought, I had to apologize first. If he struggled in school, the teachers were unfair. If I struggled, I needed to try harder. My accomplishments were never about me. They were footnotes in Blake's story. Mia is such a good sister, she always supports Blake. I convinced myself it was just normal sibling dynamics. That I was being too sensitive. That deep down, my parents still cared about me the way they cared about him. Then Blake got sick. It started with fatigue, weight loss, hospital visits that led to a diagnosis that shattered everything, kidney disease. At first, my parents were devastated. For a moment, I even thought maybe this will change things. Maybe now, they'll finally see me as a real person instead of a side character in Blake's life. I was wrong. The moment the doctor mentioned a transplant, their heads snapped toward me like I was a vending machine for spare organs. I remember sitting in that hospital room, my mom gripping my hand, already smiling through her tears. "Wouldn't it be amazing if you were a match, Mia?" she said, her voice trembling with relief, not fear. My dad nodded solemnly. "We always knew you wouldn't let us down." And Blake? He barely even looked at me. Just scrolled through his phone like this was all a given. Like it was just another problem that I would solve for him. That was the moment I realized something terrifying. They had already decided for me. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a discussion. It was an expectation. I told myself I would go through the testing, because it was the right thing to do. Because if I wasn't a match, at least I wouldn't have to deal with what came next. But deep down, I already knew how this was going to play out. I was a match. And the second those results came in, it was like the decision had already been made. My mom cried tears of joy. My dad squeezed my shoulder, saying how lucky we were. Blake gave me a single nod. Not gratitude, not relief, just acknowledgement. I felt sick. Something inside me screamed that this wasn't right. Not because I didn't want to help, but because the way they treated it, like my body was theirs to use, felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Still, I didn't say no. Not yet. Instead, I asked for time to think. My mother's smile vanished. My dad's expression hardened. "Mia, this is your brother." My mom's voice was sharp, almost offended, as if I had suggested something ridiculous. What kind of person hesitates when their own blood needs them? My dad scoffed, shaking his head in disappointment. I tried to explain. Tried to tell them I wasn't saying no, just that I wanted to understand what it meant for me. That it was major surgery. That my doctor had already told me my recovery would be long months, not weeks. That I had underlying health risks. That I'd have to take unpaid leave. That I was already struggling with student debt. That losing my income could leave me financially screwed. My mom's face twisted in disgust. "Mia, this is about your brother's life. And you're thinking about money." That was when I knew. I wasn't their daughter. I was their solution. The argument spiraled from there. My dad dismissed the medical risks. People donate kidneys all the time, and they're fine. My mom went for emotional blackmail. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us." Blake finally spoke, his voice flat and cold. "Of course. Typical." That cut deeper than I wanted to admit. Typical. Typical of me to think about myself. Typical of me to not fall in line. Typical of me to even hesitate when in his mind, my entire existence was for this exact moment. I turned to him, voice shaking. If the situation was reversed, would you give me your kidney? His eyes flickered, just for a second, toward our parents. Then he muttered, "That's not the point." Right. Of course it wasn't. I should have left right then and there, but I didn't. I gave them one last chance. I took a deep breath, looked them in the eye, and said it as clearly as I could. "I don't think I can do this." Silence. Heavy and suffocating. Then Blake scoffed. Laughed. My mother's lip quivered. Her hands clenched into fists. My father's face darkened. And in that moment I knew. They were never going to forgive me for this. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. My mother's lip trembled like she was trying to hold back a sob. But I had seen this act before. The dramatic pause, the well-timed tears. She wasn't sad. She was furious. My father's jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. And Blake? He just leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and shook his head in disgust. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath, rolling his eyes. "I should have known you'd be useless when it actually mattered." Something inside me snapped. I had spent my entire life in his shadow, giving up little things, sacrificing in small ways, because it was just expected. When he needed the last slice of pizza, I gave it to him. When he needed the new bike, I took his old one. When he needed extra time with mom and dad, I learned to stop asking for it. But this was different. I was finally drawing a line. And they were furious. "How can you be so selfish?" My mother choked out, her voice full of betrayal. "After everything we've done for you?" I swallowed the bitter laugh that threatened to rise in my throat. After everything they had done for me? What had they actually done for me that wasn't tied to Blake? I tried to stay calm. "I just need time to think. This is major surgery. It's not like I'm lending him $20, Mom." "You shouldn't have to think," she shrieked, standing up so fast her chair scraped across the tile floor. "He's your brother, Mia. Family does this for each other without question." Family. There it was. That sacred, untouchable word they had used my entire life to justify treating me like I was less than Blake. I clenched my fists. Is that how it works? Because I don't recall him ever doing anything for me. Blake let out a short, bitter laugh. "Like you've ever needed anything." I turned to him, my voice shaking. "Oh, you mean like when I asked for mom and dad to come to just one of my choir performances? Or when I won a writing competition? And they didn't even acknowledge it, because they were too busy talking about your football game. Or, hell, let's make it simple. How about the fact that I have never, not once, been the priority in this family?" My father slammed his hand down on the table. "Enough." His voice was low, seething. "You're overreacting, Mia. Stop being dramatic." Dramatic. That word had followed me my entire life. Anytime I spoke up, anytime I dared to express that something felt unfair, I was being dramatic. I shook my head. "No, Dad. I'm not. I just finally see things clearly." I looked at Blake. His face was twisted in irritation, like I was wasting his time. I turned back to my parents. "You don't see me as your daughter. You see me as an insurance policy. You see me as a backup generator to keep Blake running. But I am not a spare part. I am a person." My mom's face contorted with fury. "That's not true. We love you. We've given you everything." "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You gave me the bare minimum while Blake got everything. And now you expect me to risk my life for him? Without hesitation. Without even caring what it does to me." For the first time in my life, I saw my parents for who they really were. Not loving, not selfless, but entitled. They had never intended for me to have a choice. Blake scoffed. "This is pathetic. You're actually going to let me die?" I looked him dead in the eye. "No. I'm just choosing to finally put myself first. The way you always have." He opened his mouth to argue, but I was already standing up. I turned toward the door. My mother's voice came sharp and cold behind me. "If you walk out that door, don't bother coming back." I hesitated for only a second. Then I walked out. The door slammed behind me, but the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I walked to my car, my hands shaking, my heart pounding so hard it felt like my ribs might crack. My mother's voice still echoed in my ears. "Don't bother coming back." I should have felt something. Regret, maybe. Fear. Instead, all I felt was relief. But relief didn't last long. My phone started buzzing before I even pulled out of the driveway. First my mother, then my father, then a text from Blake. Hope you can live with yourself after this. I ignored them all and drove. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to be anywhere but here. I ended up at my Aunt Melissa's house. She opened the door, took one look at me and sighed. Come in. I had barely stepped inside before she pulled me into a hug, and for the first time that night, my chest tightened with something raw and painful. I didn't cry. Not yet. But I wanted to. We sat at her kitchen table, the same one I'd sat at 100 times as a kid, eating cookies and listening to her tell stories about her travels. She poured me a cup of tea, but I just stared at it, my hands curled around the mug like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. They lost their minds when I said no. I finally said, my voice hollow. It wasn't even a request. It was just expected. Melissa exhaled sharply. I figured this would happen. Your parents have always treated you like... She trailed off, shaking her head. Like a backup plan? I finished for her. Like I was never really a person to them? She hesitated. Then she met my eyes. Mia, there's something you don't know. A cold weight settled in my stomach. What do you mean? Melissa looked down, drumming her fingers on the table, like she was trying to decide how much to say. Your parents didn't have you because they wanted another child. She swallowed hard. They had you because Blake needed a donor. My entire body went still. What? When he was 4, he got sick. They couldn't find a match. She exhaled. So they made one. The world tilted. My breath came fast and shallow. I knew my parents saw Blake as their golden child. But this was something else. I wasn't their daughter. I was their insurance policy. I pushed my chair back so fast it screeched against the floor. You're lying. I wish I was. Melissa's voice was soft, apologetic. I wanted to tell you years ago, but I thought maybe they'd changed. Maybe they really loved you. I laughed, a sharp, broken sound. No, they didn't. It all made sense now. Why I was never the priority. Why Blake got everything and I got nothing. Why they treated me like a spare part instead of a person. I didn't exist because they wanted me. I existed because they needed me. Melissa reached for my hand, but I pulled away. My skin was ice cold. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I can't. My voice cracked. I need to get out of here. I grabbed my keys and left. Melissa called after me, but I barely heard her. My ears were ringing. My hands trembled as I got into my car and drove. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was to my parents. And I knew, without a doubt, that I could never go back. I didn't sleep that night. My mind kept replaying Aunt Melissa's words over and over. Like a broken record I couldn't turn off. They had you because Blake needed a donor. Every memory I had growing up now felt different, twisted under the weight of the truth. The birthday parties where I felt invisible. The school events they never showed up to. The way they only praised me when it involved helping Blake. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their love, when in reality, I had never been meant to be loved. By the time the sun started to rise, I had made my decision. I wasn't just walking away. I was cutting them out completely. I called my job first, telling them I needed time off. My boss thankfully was understanding. Then I went online and started looking for apartments. I couldn't stay here. Not in this town, where they could show up at any moment and try to pull me back in. I had some savings, not much, but enough. Enough to leave and start fresh. But before I could move forward, I had to end it. I drove back to my parents' house that afternoon. Not because I wanted to see them, but because I needed to say the words to their faces. When I pulled up, my mother was outside watering the garden. She looked up, startled. Then, her face lit up with something like triumph. Like she thought I had finally come to my senses. Mia, sweetheart, I knew you'd. I'm not here to change my mind. My voice was flat, emotionless. I'm here to tell you that I'm done. Her smile vanished. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice suddenly sharp. The front door opened, and my father stepped out, arms crossed. Blake was behind him, looking as smug as ever. I know the truth, I said, stepping forward. Melissa told me everything. I watched their faces closely, searching for even a flicker of guilt. But all I saw was annoyance. My mother exhaled through her nose, setting the watering can down like she was bored. Oh, for God's sake. I knew she'd poison you against us. I let out a cold laugh. She didn't poison anything. You did that yourselves. My father sighed, rubbing his temple like I was a misbehaving child. Mia, you're being ridiculous. We saved Blake's life. That was the priority. I stared at him. Not me though, right? I was never the priority. My mother crossed her arms. You're being dramatic. We gave you everything you needed. I shook my head. No, you gave me what was convenient for you. You gave me just enough to keep me functional, so I could be ready the second Blake needed something. And when I finally said no, you treated me like I was worthless. Blake scoffed. Oh, come on, Mia. You're acting like you had some horrible childhood. You didn't. You're just pissed because you finally had to make a real sacrifice, and you couldn't handle it. That was it. The final crack in whatever was left of my relationship with them. I turned to my mother and father. I'm leaving. I'm cutting you out of my life completely. Don't call me. Don't text me. Don't show up at my job or my home. You don't exist to me anymore. My mother's eyes widened in horror. Mia, don't you dare. You said it yourself. I took a step back, looking at her with the same cold detachment she had always looked at me with. If I walked out that door, I shouldn't bother coming back. I let out a slow breath. Well, I'm not coming back. I turned on my heel and walked away, feeling their stunned silence behind me. They thought they owned me. They thought they could manipulate me, guilt me, break me. But they were wrong. And for the first time in my life, I was free. Walking away from them should have felt like the hardest thing I'd ever done. But the truth, it felt like shedding dead weight. The moment I left their house, I didn't cry. I didn't second guess. I didn't wonder if I was making a mistake. Because I knew. I had spent my entire life living in their reality. And for the first time ever, I was choosing to live in my own. I drove straight to Aunt Melissa's house. My hands still gripping the wheel too tightly. My heart still hammering in my chest. When I walked inside, she didn't say anything. She just opened her arms, and I let myself collapse into her hug. She was the only person who had ever been honest with me. The only family I had left. Over the next few weeks, I started putting my new life together piece by piece. I found an apartment a couple of towns over, small, but mine. I cut off my parents' number, blocked them on everything, and told my workplace that if anyone showed up asking about me, they weren't to be let in. I wasn't taking any chances. But of course they didn't take the hint. The first time my mother tried to reach me, she used a different number. An unknown number. I answered out of habit, not expecting to hear her voice on the other end. Mia. Her tone was soft, too soft. Like she thought I'd still fall for it. It's been weeks. Don't you think this has gone on long enough? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Mom, we have nothing to talk about. She sighed like I was being a difficult child. Honey, we're family. I know you're upset, but we can fix this. Fix what? The fact that they saw me as a walking organ donor? The fact that they never even loved me beyond what I could give to Blake? I clenched my jaw. No, Mom. You don't get it. I don't want to fix this. I want to be done with it. A pause. Then her voice sharpened. You're being childish. There it was. The mask slipping. They didn't want me back. They just wanted me to fall back in line. I didn't say another word. I just hung up. They tried again. And again. Different numbers, emails, even showing up at Aunt Melissa's house begging her to make me listen. But I didn't listen. Because for once in my life, I was the one making the rules. And the best part, without me their world crumbled. I heard through Melissa that Blake wasn't doing so well. His condition had worsened. The hospital waitlist wasn't moving fast enough. And my parents, so sure I'd be their perfect solution, hadn't even considered a backup plan. They had no one else to turn to. And now, they were drowning under the weight of their own entitlement. A year ago, I would have cared. But not anymore. One night, I sat in my new apartment, curled up on my couch with a book, a candle burning nearby. It was small. It wasn't fancy. But it was mine. And for the first time in my life I was happy. They thought I couldn't exist without them. That I needed their approval, their validation, their twisted version of love. But they were wrong. I was never meant to live in their world. I was meant to build my own. Months passed, and the silence from my parents became louder than their voices ever had been. At first, they tried everything: calls, messages, even showing up uninvited at Aunt Melissa's house. But after a while, even their desperate attempts faded into nothing. I had won, but even victories come with scars. There were nights when I woke up expecting to hear my mother's voice telling me how ungrateful I was. Days where I second-guessed whether I had been too harsh. Guilt is a funny thing. Even when you know you did the right thing, it still lingers like a shadow, whispering doubts when you least expect them. Then one evening, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, but I knew who it was from before I even opened it. Blake's handwriting. I almost threw it away. Almost. But something in me, maybe the last remaining piece of the sister I had once been, needed to see what he had to say. I unfolded the paper and read, "Mia, I guess you're happy now. You got your way, and I'm paying the price for it. Mom and Dad don't talk about you anymore, but I know they still blame you. I blame you too. If you had just done what you were supposed to, none of this would have happened. I wouldn't be stuck here waiting, and they wouldn't be falling apart. But you didn't care, did you? You left us to rot. But I hope you think about me sometimes. I hope you remember that while you're living your selfish little life, I'm still here. Still waiting. Still suffering. Enjoy your freedom." I stared at the letter for a long time, waiting for the guilt to return. But it never did, because for the first time in my life, I truly saw Blake for what he was. Not a brother. Not a victim. Just another entitled, bitter person who thought he could manipulate me. I folded the letter neatly and walked to my kitchen, opened the trash can, dropped it inside, and with that, I closed the lid on all of them. A week later, I accepted a job in another state, packed my bags, left the place where I had spent my whole life trapped. There was no sadness, no hesitation, no looking back, because the best part of starting over? You don't have to carry your past with you.